Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, and we're making our way to our 10,000 decks. Right now we're looking at a Kyler Sigarden Emissary Humans deck. Human Tribal by Mortezino, who has kind of a specific request. They like playing humans, they built this deck themselves, and they've been having a kind of hard time in their commander group. Now, it seems like the other commander groups, the other players, have created a bit of an environment where we have one mill player and two other players that don't play to the board. Wait until our human player creates a large board, and then board wipe and punish them out of the game. So, in order to win against groups like that, we're going to start looking at certain options to increase the power level of your deck, and we're going to try to adjust how we play this deck. The first thing we need to acknowledge is Kyler is a critical mass style commander. What that means is this. So what does Kyler do? Kyler says that whenever another human enters, Kyler gets a +1/+1 counter. And then a static ability that says all your humans grow as Kyler for +1/+1 for each +1/+1 on Kyler themselves. So what this means is that in order for Kyler to be good, you need humans on the battlefield in order to have the anthem that Kyler provides affect them and grow them. And then you also need humans in hand to play. This is asking a lot from a tribal deck. You are spending a lot, it's a lot of work you're doing to get Kyler to work. So that might be the first situation of why you're a little behind. Looking at another option, such as Tauren's Fist of the Angels, who naturally, every time you play a creature, you get another creature, you can see the difference between these two strategies, right? Kyler requires a board and a constant stream of creatures, and Tauren just needs the stream of creatures. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily going to Tauren's, but it's just something to think about. The other thing I want to say is that I'm going to recommend to you that when synergy decks are hated on, they get much weaker. What that means is if your opponents can pinpoint the strongest cards and remove them, you're going to have a harder time. For example, when we look at something like Thalia's Lieutenant is really strong when you have a board of humans, and really strong after you have a board of humans. But if you don't have Thalia's Lieutenant at the right time, Thalia's Lieutenant is not a good card. If your opponents have wiped the board and you play Thalia's Lieutenant, it does nothing. So you need to recognize this is a synergy card. It requires the humans. So if your opponents pressure you, it's not going to be as strong. Let's look down. Victory's Envoy says at the beginning of your upkeep, you get a +1/+1 counter across the board. Now I want you to think, if this creature was still 5 mana for a 3/3, and it said at the beginning of your upkeep, put a +1/+1 counter on it, would you still play it? Probably not. That is because Victory's Envoy requires a board of creatures already in order to be good. It is a synergy card. It is a synergy card to your strategy. So, what are we going to do if we don't want to lean on synergy cards as much? Well, what we want are cards that by themselves have a lot of strength, but still happen to coincide with our strategy. So, you're already playing one of these cards. Eternal Witness is one of them, right? Eternal Witness is a very good commander card, and it happens to be a a human. And that's really good for you. So, playing cards like Eternal Witness will help you deal with the fact that you have 3 opponents that are trying to pressure your strategy. Let me give you at least a few more. Let's type in Thalia. You have Thalia's Lieutenant, you should be playing Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Thalia herself is a very, very strong card. She requires no support, and she just makes non-creature spells cost one more. This is good against your mill opponent, and this is good against your other opponents that aren't playing creatures to the board. Most likely they're drawing cards, or they're playing ramp spells, or playing artifacts and enchantments, and Thalia is going to pressure their ability to do so. Whenever you play this card, or anyone plays this card, I would like people to take note of exactly how much extra mana she takes away from your opponents. Because in my experience, if you think of her as adding 5 extra mana, 6 extra mana while she's alive to your opponent's spells, that's a lot of mana. And that is a very powerful effect. She also has first strike, she's a 2/1, perfect. So let's look at the next one. It's also Thalia. You can never get enough Thalia. Thalia Heretic Cathar is a 3/2, and it says your opponent's non-basic lands and creatures enter the battlefield tapped. So what makes her strong? What makes her strong is the fact that she is also heavily pressuring your opponents from the fact that they're playing from behind. If they are not put creatures in, they're not putting creatures into play. When they do after this, it's going to put them behind because those creatures are coming in tapped. They cannot block as well. Also, you can use this creature to stop non-basic lands from coming in. Everyone's going slower. It'll buy you time to get further ahead. Additionally, I would like to find we're going to say return creature battlefield in white. And then we're going to sort by mana value. I'm going to check the prices because I know you have a bit of a budget here. And I do want you to play Ephemerate to bounce your creatures in and out of play because your commander cares when creatures enter play and not necessarily if you cast them. So this is a really clean way to protect your commander, but also get a few more triggers in. Charming Prince also does the same thing of exiling another creature and bringing it back, and it's a human, so I'd play that as well. But funnily, that's not what I'm here for. I am looking for, let us say, let's go back and let's say instant. Nope, let's say sorcery. I think I'm thinking of Return to the Ranks, but I want to just see if I've got the wrong name. Return to the Ranks. Yeah, let's see the price. It's $1. That's about right. Return to the Ranks, recommission, especially patch up. These are cards to consider that can bring your creatures back after a board wipe, especially Return to the Ranks and patch up are really good because they can bring multiple creatures back. Because after a board clear, you're going to need to set up again, and that's going to be difficult. Over here, you have a lot of board clears. I would suggest you have too many board clears because a lot of them are kind of bad for you because you are the one who is playing to the board in your group. You have the most creatures, so you don't want board clears. So I'm going to suggest that if you play one, you're going to play Dusk to Dawn. Dusk and Dawn are it's an aftermath card. So the first half you cast from your hand, destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater, which when you don't have your commander out, should protect all of your creatures. Almost all of them are less than 3 power, so you'll get to keep them. And then Dawn, you can cast from your graveyard to return all creatures with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. This is a very clean way to get your cards back. And if you might have noticed, if your mill opponent mills you, Dawn can be cast from the graveyard after being milled and go back into your hand. So that's very, very strong. I'm also going to argue for, let's take out the stacks cards. I'm also going to argue for a few pieces of equipment. And I'm not going to go too specific on which ones we want. I'm going to suggest, I'm honestly just going to say any type of equipment is good in this kind of deck, but specifically things like Behemoth Sledge. I want things like, that's a little more expensive. I want, honestly, any kind of equipment that'll stick around, because if the board is wiped, I want you to keep some creatures on board. I want you to be able to recover a lot faster by having creatures and then re-equipping. This isn't out yet, but this equips to humans, so that's really nice. But anything that you can allow you to rebuild faster, how much is this? Even something like this, +3, vigilance and trample. When it dies, you attach it to something else. When they wipe your board, you get to keep your equipment and you get to come back from that point. Um, Then I'm going to give you a few more quick general tips before finishing it off. I think your card draw should be in green and should be based on cards that draw you a card when a creature enters play or is cast. So Guardian Project, for example, says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature, draw a card. Now this is outside of your budget, but this is just the example. I want you to look and find cards like this because you're going to want to play a lot of humans, and therefore you're going to want to keep drawing every time you play a human. I see Augur of Autumns here. That's exactly the idea you want because it lets you play cards off the top of your deck that are human, which is the equivalent of drawing with them. So these kind of effects are very good because they allow you to keep going, especially when you are at the start or the middle of the game. And if at late game you can just drop Augur of Autumn and get a few cards out, that's also really strong. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, because I think the biggest problem with this deck is not so much what it is, but who you're playing with and how you're playing. Now, this isn't really deck advice. This is more play group and strategy advice. So I'm not gonna go too deep into it. But it sounds like you're in a situation where your deck is kind of being pushed out of the meta. If your opponents are playing in a way that makes your deck particularly weak, it is difficult to play that deck well. So outside of changing your deck and picking up a new strategy, I'm going to give you a few tips because I have played in groups where everyone will act like I am we call it arch enemy, the opponent that needs to be defeated. You know, all of your other opponents, they talk amongst themselves, they look at your board and say, "We need to stop that." They use a board clear and it's pretty much free because they don't have creatures themselves. So there's a few strategies to kind of counteract that. One is to talk up politics, cut deals with your opponents, make exchanges, tell them that if you don't kill your creatures, you'll be able to attack another opponent. But that doesn't work when your opponents are not going to be convinced by that. So actually, I'm going to give you a much more straightforward advice. Stop listening to them. Stop listening to the arguments that they're making about how you're getting too strong. All you need to do is defeat them one at a time. You find the player that is most likely to cause you the most amount of troubles, and you only attack them until they are out of the game. Once they are out of the game, you only have to deal with the two other players. A third of the problems you have to deal with are no longer there. Now, This wouldn't work in a regular kind of situation because if in a regular game where everyone's trying to win instead of trying to stop you, it doesn't work as well. But in a situation where players are actively trying to suppress your deck, you just need to put them in the ground. You don't need to play fairly. If you are going into a fight where it's 3-on-1, you don't have to be gentle and spread your damage around. You pick one player and you keep attacking them. And no matter what they say, no matter how they call you it's unfair, you tell them that, you have board clears. You can defeat my deck. You're constantly telling me how my deck is too strong. I have to take you off the table. That level of pressure, is really strong in this format. I think people underestimate aggro because they look at aggro and they say, oh, you're playing creatures and you're attacking for 2 or 3 a turn. That's not that much damage and I have 40 life. That's because usually you're attacking multiple opponents and you're usually not attacking the same opponent turn after turn. When the pressure is on from one direction, it is incredibly powerful. So those would be my suggestions. I know it's kind of all over the place. This is a good direction for a deck, but it feels like you're playing against 3 players that are playing against your deck. So it's going to be difficult to run a deck like this. So I wish you luck. If you end up making changes, I'd love to see this deck again. If you end up making a different kind of deck or changing into a different green-white commander, that could be a real good idea. You keep your humans because humans is a very good strategy, and you just make a few adjustments here and there, and that should be able to put you in and get you some wins. Very, very quickly, because I would be a little amiss not to say this. Here are some cards that I feel like you could cut. You can definitely cut some of the board clears. I think you're playing too many. You are the aggro player. You can cut Serac and Goreclaw, excuse me, because it is 6 mana and it has a lot of mana. Victory's Envoy equally is particularly weak. You can also think about cutting Reliquary Tower because you will never draw enough cards for this card to matter. So don't play a card that doesn't tap for your colors. Colossus Majesty is also very weak because when you play this, you have taken up a turn to play this, and if they board wipe, you don't even draw a single card. I want you to look, this is just my end advice. I want you to look at this deck and count everything that doesn't do anything if your opponent wipes the board right after. Take those out and put creatures in. Put both Thalias, put any human creature that can attack strongly, put it all together, and focus on one opponent. I hope this helped. I hope this was helpful for you to understand your deck and make it a bit stronger. As always, I would appreciate if you comment, liked, or subscribed. And if you want to submit any decks to me, the form is in the YouTube video description and the YouTube channel description. Thanks a lot.